Welcome back. This is Today. Russian President Vladimir Putin is calling for unity and calm after chief of the Wagner mercenary group threatened to topple Russia's military leadership. Now, it's alleged that the Wagner mercenary group has seized key military headquarters in the south of Russia. Those include the Ukraine Special Military Operation Command Center in Rostov-on-Don. Wagner group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin spearheaded much of Russia's offensives in Ukraine, but he's now turned on the Kremlin's military commanders, accusing them of firing one of his men. To make sense, we're joined by international relations expert Brooks Spector. A very good afternoon to you, Brooks, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm pretty sure I got the commander's name there wrong, but I suppose that's the least of the problems that we are facing as these geopolitical developments happen. So the president of Russia has called this act an act of treason. So with that in mind, perhaps just give our viewers a bit of context as to what exactly is playing out at the moment.
Oh, good afternoon. Good to be with you. Anything we say now can possibly be contradicted by whatever happens later this afternoon or tomorrow. So we'll all have to take this with that due precaution, because events are going to change dramatically and rapidly, perhaps. Yevgeny Prigozhin, he, for a number of years, he was a key ally of Vladimir Putin. I mean, he'd risen from being an ex-convict to being, I'm not making this up, to being a hot dog salesman, to becoming the what was sometimes referred to as Putin's chef, because he kept getting very lucrative contracts, tenders in the local context, for feeding hospitals and schools and government facilities. And eventually he branched out and set up his very own paramilitary unit, the Wagner group, which has been carrying out much of Russia's more militaristic foreign policy endeavors or adventures, a number of them in Africa, among other places, of course. And they were something of the hard point of the spear in the invasion of Ukraine, and they did much of the heavy fighting around the small city of Bakhmut in the eastern part of Ukraine over the last year. And the problem for them is that to get the military strength they needed, they started enlisting people either as mercenaries or ex-convicts or convicts who would get their sentences commuted if they served a certain amount of time. And so this army was created out of a very heterogeneous collection of people. And the head of the Wagner group has been accusing the Russian military now for some months of starving it from getting sufficient weapons and other supplies. And ultimately, he has now decided that the time was right, apparently, to take the government on directly, and especially the Russian military hierarchy.
That's an interesting point.
As I see.
Please continue.
I was going to say, he's taken on the Russian government. The government, in the person of Vladimir Putin, has now accused him of being treasonous. And this sounds to me as if the gloves have been thrown down for the duel to death over this. And his army has seized Rostov-on-Don, which is effectively the southern headquarters for the Russian army in its invasion of Ukraine, and has been moving northward up the road in the direction of Moscow. One key question that people are beginning to ask: is there sufficient Russian military inside Russia, as opposed to engaging in the invasion of Ukraine, to actually stop the Wagner group, which would be about, roughly speaking, 25,000 personnel or thereabouts? And the answer is there may not be. And so we don't really know how this is going to turn out.
I want to just talk about how perhaps Ukraine could take advantage of this situation. But before that, why would there be a concern or the frustration that the Russian government was starving the commander's military group or paramilitary group of weapons and other resources? To what extent would the Russian government benefit from that allegation that they're being starved of essential resources?
Well, I think the argument goes essentially like this: if you have an ally in your that's fighting with you, if they get more weaponry or more supplies or more munitions than you do, and they aren't under your command, you don't really have the ability to direct or lead them, let alone to order them to do anything. They're on their own for whatever self-aggrandizement may be possible. Even if up until recently it was assumed that the head of the Wagner group and Vladimir Putin were very close allies, it seems now that that relationship has been fairly well sundered, and that's not likely to continue, especially if you call the one a traitor. That tends to hurt your relationship just a bit.
Yeah. So could then Ukraine take some kind of military advantage of this situation, or will it depend on the next steps that will be taken by the Russian government?
Well, I mean, that also is an important question, because, as you know, the Ukrainian forces have been testing the Russian army in its various locations, areas that they had seized in what was assumed to be the spring-summer counteroffensive. Now, they haven't engaged in all-out activities yet, but they've been testing and pushing and pinpricking along the way. If the Russian army is in turmoil, and if the Wagner group is no longer fighting the Ukrainians, but is in fact fighting the Russian army, then it stands to reason that the Ukrainians may well feel that time and circumstance are on their side, at least at this point. But then the question for them must be, where precisely should they attack? Because remember, the Russians have had over a year to fortify, to build trenches, to lay minefields, to do all manner of things in the areas that they seize control of. And so gaining that back is not simply marching forward and saying, we have declared that we have been successful, because it becomes far too much like the trench warfare of World War I than it does the rapid movement of tanks and soldiers in the beginning parts of World War II. And if you are the Ukrainian army, they may be well trained and now well supplied. They are certainly not outnumbered by Russia.
That's a very important point, and I'm just wondering, Brooks, should a conflict break out between the two sides, is there any kind of international intervention that can be explored? We saw some peace negotiations with African leaders a few short weeks ago, and I'm just wondering if the international community could somehow get involved here to prevent any kind of conflict, or should one break out, it can come to some kind of end?
I don't know that any part of Russia, whether it's the Wagner group or it's the Russian army or the Russian government, would countenance the idea of foreigners getting involved in what is unquestionably and uncontestedly a domestic internal affair inside Russia. That would be something extraordinary. I will say the one thing that does concern me, well, two things really. One is to the extent to which the fighting may actually become fiercer or more widespread. What effects is it going to have on neighboring nations besides Ukraine? And I'm thinking here of Belarus, which is to the north of Ukraine, in the Baltic states, and further to the south in the Caucasus region. And the second part of this, and I don't want to inject a note of fear and trembling in your audience, but it's something you have to at least keep in the back of your mind, is that Russia has a very large stock of nuclear weapons, both strategic, that is intercontinental, and tactical, which are presumably designed to be used on battlefields. And if the news that we heard over the last several weeks was that the Russians were moving tactical nuclear weapons into their then ally of Belarus, it is at least an open question as to who is going to have the command, the control, and the launch codes of those weapons. As I say, I don't want to strike fear into everybody, but on the other hand, it's something that I am sure that people in Berlin and Washington and London and elsewhere are paying particularly close attention to, because when one side in a civil conflict begins to feel that its back is against the wall, you begin to think about things that we really didn't want to have to think about.
Yeah, no, absolutely, especially if President Putin is saying that decisive action will be taken. We don't know what that decisive action will look like. I suppose that we'll have to wait and see over the next coming hours and days what transpires. Brooks, thank you very much for your time. That is Brooks Spector, who's an international relations expert, joining us now to give us a breakdown of what exactly is happening within Russia. It looks like an internal conflict could be ensuing should no resolution be found in the next coming hours or days.